very nice to have that noise stop. And it's very nice to be able to be introducing the introducer of our second Emmons lecture this year. I explained at the first of the year when Dr. Constance Perrin was here as the Emmons Distinguished Professor of Urban and Regional Planning and spoke. I explained the history of the Emmons Distinguished Professorship. This is the 10th year of the special professorship at Ball State. The professorship was set up to commemorate the progress that the university made in going from 1,000 students to 14,000 students while Dr. Emmons, John R. Emmons, was president of the university. The professorship alternates between around the 5 colleges, and so we get to honor or get the honor of having several professionals with us every 5 years. To introduce the Emmons Distinguished Professor in Architecture tonight, I call on the Chairman of the Department of Architecture, Professor Kenneth Carpenter.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlie. Ben Weese received his B.Arch and M.Arch from Harvard. He studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. From 57 to 77, he was principal in the firm of Harry Weese and Associates. In 77, he was president of that firm and decided to leave and open his own office, Weese, Seeger, Hickey, and Weese. They've won many awards, both Ben as an individual and the firm. Probably the most notable thing, at least for me, is that the firm has, even before it was social or before it was the fashionable thing to do perhaps, Ben was championing a lot of causes of the inner city, demonstrating to save buildings, working with rehab and adaptive reuse projects. Not only has the firm managed to do that and keep their head above water financially, I think they have gained the respect and retained the respect of both their clients and the profession as a whole. I'm really not sure that I can say any more about the firm than that. It's a very fine firm and a very fine organization, and it's a pleasure to introduce Mr. Ben Weese.
Never mind.
Except I probably reversed it.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, Ken. I appreciate your inviting me down, or myself and my colleagues here down to the Ball State. I'm very impressed. I'm a Hoosier by background. My great-grandfather homesteaded on the Wabash River about 1833 up in Huntington area, so I never had the pleasure of living here. It's a great place. They got a couple of good basketball teams. So I thank you for this occasion, and it's not my want to bore anybody. I hope if I see anybody walking out, I'll stop them. But I grew my beard for this occasion, too. I thought I had to have some kind of a subject like concerning underground values in architecture, and I'll try to explain that. This will be in 3 parts. My theory, which is the first part, shouldn't last too long. Then the works, I'll try to get that in. We want to declare, I hope by the end of this thing you'll understand where our position is, and then a conclusion. I chose this title. It contains something of mystery and suggests a slight conspiracy about what may be about to happen or publicly surface. It's an attempt to explore the implicit, sometimes the subconscious, or the unrevealed or unrecognized forces that work on architects and architecture. The current operating atmosphere is just the opposite, I think, where all the forms of media are very influential and deal in image. They deal in effects and surface appearances. It's no wonder that the architect and the student spends his time with form and theories of form, because that is the printed image that bombards the public. It is the contemporary architectural power structure. And I want to try to present a few mild antidotes to these tendencies. It is interesting to take current trends and tastes as they have evolved, the sudden voracious interest in all periods of historical architecture, from Palladian, Romantic classicism, Beaux-Arts, right through to the high technology. But let's posit the opposite for a minute. Non-form, non-image, indirect historic, or unconscious historic, I guess you could call it, primitive, non-graphic, low-tech. This gets close to some of the clear feelings I have about what I think you can do. The underground side of architecture is what doesn't show, and like the foundation of a building, is what solidifies and anchors the final product, and just may be the kind of hidden resource that allows you to go beyond chance or taste. There are incidentally architects, as you know, who take a little position in schools, offices, factories, houses, and should go underground and into a more sensitive balance with nature. The point in many cases, I think, is well taken, but the more difficult underground question is exactly what will be the issues 10 years from now. Outside forces ultimately invade the realm of architectural theory, much as, one analogy would be the Protestant heretics. Historically, they upset the Roman Catholic closed system, or we certainly weren't prepared for the Vietnamese irregulars defeating a high-tech computer-guided military machine which was supposed to produce a victory like a product almost. My contention is that outside forces of this sort, unheralded in a sense, in the next 10 years will radically change architectural theory. Current evidence is that while architects are producing 50th and 100th generation curtain walls, shimmering glass, and given national awards as an article of faith by other architects, clients are dazedly playing catch-up, retrofitting these energy monsters. In a schizoid way, we can't think of high design and high energy efficiency as possibly being one and the same thing. It is curious that some of the leaders have evoked glass of all sorts, mirror glass, gray glass, bronze glass, many glasses, without mullions and without visible means of support as the kind of quintessent symbol of the state of the art. And I find it interesting, historically, they bring on the culmination walls and roofs, a kind of the Crystal Palace movement, at the precise moment when we can't afford it, when 50% of our oil is being imported from overseas and the percent is rising all the time. The underground movement, again, quote-unquote underground movement, is saying, well, something is slightly awry here. To invest capital is one thing in buildings, but literally to burn it up is another order of issue. The architects, afraid of being ostracized right at this point, have usually give their awards, one, to bigness, although they give awards to bigness kind of grudgingly, huge, the biggest thing is always the best, and two, to glassiness. They give awards to glassiness with a kind of a rhapsodic fervor I can't understand. I've always tried not to do that or fought against it, being on the minority position, I guess. My prediction is that by 10 years from now, outside forces again will have dictated another aesthetic. The concept of architecture as a matter of personal choice and taste will have receded. Architects will have adjusted, and the environment might have benefited as a result. The finicky, complex architectural elegance of the late Roman Empire was overrun by the Dark Ages, and crudities emerged that eventually brought the solid, austere, and the power of the Romanesque. the recently dethroned heroes of the modern movement in architecture, in their beginnings, reacted. We have to remember what they reacted to. They were reacting to a given situation, high Victorian, petite bourgeois taste, youth against the establishment. They brought on cold functionalism and dumped the decoration. Now, modernism was the establishment, still is, I guess, and it's being attacked by the so-called postmodernists who want columns and Palladian windows, and they have control of the media, spreading the word fast, but they admit also that it's definitely transitional. So we're playing with styles again, and the underground in me, I haven't caught up with that movement yet, but I didn't read Venturi's book until 10 years after he wrote it. So I think I'm never quite up with the time. I think as you see going on, I'll try to explain. I think the slides will definitely indicate a position. I think its style is still a resultant of larger forces and not sought as an end, or should not be sought as an end in itself. I never was totally loyal to modernism, and I don't find any reason to accuse it harshly now, and the dialectic that goes on now are accusing it overly, I think. But it seems that those who embraced it the hardest are the most eager to rail against it. I spent time around Gropius, and he was a great coalescing force for the second and third generation of modernists. And I did my share of projects on brown wrapping paper, and I think the jury said that this scheme is willful and arbitrary, it was one of the words, but we label that kind of movement, each student seeking his own way, bucking the trend. But I'm still bucking the trend, I guess. There was enough age between my brother Harry and myself that a kind of a second generation has actually occurred inside the office. I guess it was one of the reasons for my leaving that firm. One might describe that office as, and led by Harry's very facile pencilings, as an eclectic pursuit of a tremendous variety of trends. Take an example. Felix Candela came to town about 1958, and there was a lunch, and there was a lot of discussions about hyperbolic parabolas and so forth. And in that year, two projects emerged with hyperbolic parabola shapes, but never to be seen again. There are two projects that exactly coincided with the visit of Felix Candela. Another example of the office of Harry Weese would be the ability to do high-tech or organic architecture almost at one and the same, depending on what the occasion called for. And I think no better example of that is in the work of high-tech, for instance, or at least industrial architecture, Cummins Diesel Company in Columbus, Indiana, or on the opposite end, the nuts and berries type situation, First Baptist Church of Columbus, Indiana, which I think was a very popular building. My distinction from all of this was a try for even greater simplicity, which tended to the boring, the peasant, the crude, or even Spartan. I gave a talk at Washington University once praising the post and lintel in reaction to thin shells, tents, exposed trusses, etc., that kind of overleaped the buildings that they were trying to hold up. I attempted to explain to myself the reductivist modern volumes. There was a lot of later work of in the 60s of Pei and Barnes and Roach and the Weese office when we worked with them, as we did on a few collaborations. They were, in their simplest forms, were hollowed out volumes, often without windows, just brick shapes, many of them institutional buildings for universities. And the windows seemed to be on the places that were carved out on the sides of the parts that had been carved away. Through all of this, by accident or predilection, I never designed or worked on a curtain wall. I'm taking the oath. I never worked on a curtain wall. it's kind of curious, but I have to say that as a way of developing distinctions that may become more important as this thing unravels here. Modernism was a purism unattainable. The binuclear scheme was a favorite, 2 parts with a bridge in between, but you could design the bridge, successfully. Technology was a tool, not an end. And I really am a farmer at heart. I wanted to be a farmer when I was a kid. And I like what comes out of the earth, vegetables and wood grows out of the rock. Post-modernism is a word I always use, quote unquote, it's what everybody has to respond to, I guess, is a setting up of kind of straw men to knock down in a way to currently to define today's uncertainties. And admittedly, by those proponents of postmodernism, it's transitional. But we can all see other kinds of difficulties in the pursuit of architecture. Tight programs, no money, assessment of preservation or existing buildings, which require all sorts of compromise, tough given situations, cutbacks of, intrusions of other things that you can't control. And I think that's not so bad because the tabula rasa, or a blank sheet that people draw when we describe urban renewal, for instance, as there have been books written on the disaster of urban renewal. It nets really a cheaper and shorter-lived building as a replacement of the environment that it was supposed to improve. So this all leads to reductive architecture, simplicity, doing without, Shaker, Quaker, I don't know, around here it's Brethren, I guess, or what is it, Mennonite? I can't remember. But, really pared down to get at the essence. And they're all historical implications, but they're kind of subliminal, these influences, not picking off the surface or taste, in other words. Very rooted in tradition, actually, and never losing one's roots. We're all Midwesterners. It's a region. It lies between the 2 coasts, and most people don't know where it is. I mean, if they live in New York, or a lot of people. I had a classmate at Harvard, and he said, "Gee, you're from Chicago?" And he said, I said, "Yeah." He says, "I'm from White Plains." He says, "I've never been west of the Merritt Parkway." I always liked that one. So, it seems to me that this kind of thing is different. We are in an end of a period, but the reaction is different. Instead of taste and a vast problem of what to choose in the way of forms, which is always excruciating, and the problem of surfeit or, creature comforts and showy decadence and all of that, it's a passing fancy. The underground says something else. Something else is about to happen, the unforeseen, the fresh, the unpopular, the unheralded, the awkward, the ungainly, crude, but earnest. Architectural ages end in confusion of all sorts. Stylistic spin-offs, fussy forms, ironies, dualities, chimeras, concoctions, appearances. I'm just reading what I read in the newspaper, or in architectural magazines, I guess. Implicit and explicit metaphors. I read that the other day. Confusing dialectic arguments. I guess that's definitely where we are. And like a theological dispute among architects, it's like when in the church you become more interesting, these arguments become most interesting only to the disputants, and they run to minutiae and non-essentials that cater to the priests and the curates. These are kind of private visions of reality, isolated from what's about to happen. And things will happen outside these kinds of established academies, if you want to call them that. They happen in the street. They happen with your confrontation with outside contacts, clients. They happen in foreign capitals now, unfortunately, things that we can't control. And they are essentially what I try to explain. The outside forces, I only touch a bit of them. It's the underground. Now we'll take a another, that's the first part. That wasn't too bad. I didn't use too many words, I think, that once I waited 5 minutes for a sentence to end when Colin Rowe gave a lecture, but I forgot to count up my longest sentence here. But I want to talk about the work that some of it comes out of the 20 years I spent at Harry Weese & Associates. It gives you what I was doing within that office. The other of it is the beginnings of our new firm. And as you look at this work, I'd like to give you some adjectives that explain what I think we're trying to say with it. Trying to say that it's simple, it's sparse, it's opaque, sometimes it's massive, sometimes it's informal and casual, nonchalant, quiet, bordering on the dull sometimes. One of my friends said it was grumpy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the adjectives describe, and as it's opposed to, it's not complex, it's not transparent, it's not layered, it's not formal. I don't think it's very witty, clever, metaphorical, gridded, structuralist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In contradistinction to other things, we've been kind of just going along. Now, if I could have the first slide. Oh, I got the control of this situation. I'm sorry. There's two sets of Is it possible that someone up there could remotely focus this? Because I can't hardly see. I'm afraid if I start playing with this focus, and they do need focus. Is there any chance that the man on the balcony could focus this work? Are you there? Can't be done, because I really can't see it from the side here. Is it got an automatic focus? Okay, you always start with your, what is your graphic approach to things? So I started with a series of sketches. It's my trip, or your trip, or Louis Kahn had some wonderful trips. We all have our trips, but I had to show you what my trips look like in the graphic response. This is Schönbrunn in Austria, Vienna. It's a village along the Danube looking out of Czechoslovakia and the eastern Austria. That's the left bank of Paris. And these are early sketches. Maybe 15 years old. This is Villa Malacontenta by Palladio. I guess everybody takes his trip, everybody looks at buildings, but you have to realize that what one takes away from these experiences is vastly different. My list of buildings, your list of buildings, and other historians' lists of buildings are going to be different. We've all looked at Palladio, but we take away different things. This is my street. I did this. My kid gave me a set of watercolors for Christmas, red, green, and yellow. And it's a street. I took out the buildings I didn't like, but it's from my living room window. This is a project of Weese, Seegers, Hickey, Weese, a joint drawing by Ben Weese and Tom Hickey, currently to be built. Now we go back historically to a point 20 years ago, this is in Columbus, Indiana. This is not modern architecture. I guess I have to start by that. So this was historic recall at the very moment when Sputnik was being sent up in the air and everything was supposed to be tough again. We weren't going to indulge the kids, so we built them a box. Columbus Junior High School. And very straight in all of those adjectives that I tried to tell you. Before I forewarn you, let's say, in commencing these slides. It's got an interior court. It's basically a donut. There it is in sketch form, the hole in the middle. Terrible place to go to school. It must have scared the kids, I don't know. But I think at that time, in '59, everybody was going to large one-story schools. One of the schools was a Trump school. It had no windows. There was no relationship to the outside. And large, vast experimentations on flexibility. We figured, well, a schoolhouse is a schoolhouse. It's a traditional form. We'll take a risk. And they put it 3 stories high, which was very unusual because it 3 on the side and 2 on the ends. But they weren't doing that then. So again, I'm just saying that we were always a little bit out of phase with what was about ready to happen. That way, if you're always out of phase, you're never in phase, so you can kind of coast along through all these ups and downs, and the net result is kind of a consistency. I want to try to point that out. That's the diagram. This is a building in Carleton College, which again is in 2 parts. It's a concert hall in Northfield, Minnesota, and this is the concert hall, split by a plaza and a oval-shaped theater. Again, very recessive, or kind of formal in a way, but a little brooding, you might say. Sullivan might be some of our influence here, the setting back of the sides, the banding as the structure gets thinner as it goes up. This is the theater, 2 opposing entrances kind of lit up with lights in the plaza. The diagram, the basement, or the subterranean connection. The plan, a very traditional space for the music, because the repertory of music is traditional. You know, it starts with, I don't know, Buxtehude, and it goes on through Brahms, Beethoven, you know, and so forth. The kind of music that's written for it and would be performed in that with an organ. And then the more experimental theater with moving pie-shaped parts. There's a hall, very restful, light, you know, acoustically very much like many of the concert halls in Europe. Good sight lines, which mean good hearing lines. If you can see, you can hear. The organ, Holtkamp. Another institutional use along the same lines, very blocky. It might go to that hollowed out volume kind of form that I described, which is a prismatic shape and then gouged and eaten out of Williams College Library, Williamstown, Massachusetts. It's a very prominent building, but is kind of recessive. It's in the middle of the campus, but it needs to do some interconnecting between parts because it sits astride of what's a desire line for walking between places. And it is a very well-received building, and it intends to do nothing other than what it did. The president of that university, at Williams College rather, at that time, insisted on natural ventilation. He was really, and this thing is cool. Any day you want to go in there. Of course, it's in the Berkshires, but it gets hot there too. But I mean, by locating windows and trying a little bit, cutting down the glass, you have a perfect environment. We spent a lot of time on the interior sensibility to the furnishings, different kinds of arrangements. Here you're sitting at the window with a kind of a fixed chair that rotates, so you're kind of side saddle along these pallets looking at the view. The way of circulating down through a ramped system that allows you to approach it from 2 sides. You see, if you go down and then up, you can have one control point, very important in a library, but still make a street that runs right through, which was the eastern to the western part of the campus. Arcaded on the south for sun protection. The other shot you saw with the windows placed was north. It was the 1 or 2 days of the year that it gets the sun. Here's someone sitting kind of like on a double-decker bus with people tucked underneath. You get up there through a ladder. Bleached ash. The idea was to reduce the light levels but keep the tone of the backdrop so light that you didn't get absorbed. In a dark room, you put in hundreds of watts and nothing comes out because it's absorbed with the furniture. Task lighting, low level, that wouldn't increase the buildup of BTUs. Here was the most intensive use where someone goes into his little carrel and pulls the drawer on the desk surface forward and sits there. These are very popular. The other person climbs up and they're interlocking. He's sitting on top and it kind of goes along like an airplane. Put it on wheels. It's a double. There they are. Some guy with his feet up in the air. Anyway, the extreme attention to different pupil or student configurations, how they'd want to study, and they all stay there as a result. Here's housing in Chicago. I'm going to show now, I'm going into another kind of, this is kind of coming out of the kind of volumetric, hollowed forms that done about the same time, very expensive and toned down, a centralized facade so you know where your front door is. Very careful about, this is my house, you know, and not too many windows. The diagram is this, it's an L-shaped housing system. That's the essence of it there, a slight overweighing motif on the top, and then up off the ground to make a formal distinction from your turf and someone else's turf. Then this is some urban design we did in Norfolk. If you look in the middle there, I'm going to point out that building was a building that we reconstructed on that site, but these streets are designed like boulevards, but they exist in the other part of this neighborhood, so we just made a square with housing. We designed the way that this thing was supposed to go together. Then the other architects were supposed to come and complete the projects in colonial, whatever. We did the network of the grid, the infrastructure. But over here you see a strange shape, kind of lozenge-shaped building that's one of the buildings that we designed. So we're going to be looking at this building here, which is a centerpiece, a promotional device which would be turned into a restaurant after they had marketed out of this building. It's a ferry terminal, quite a nice thing. I'm looking from the tall building, and I'll show you later, back at this ferry terminal to the downtown of Norfolk with these boulevard systems lavishly planted. The terminal building itself the parts were saved and torn and down and left in a warehouse, and we re-erected them for the Department of Urban Renewal. And it would make a very nice house. It's about 16 feet wide. We put a floor in it, but it used to be a place where they sold flowers and a small market. It was kind of like an outside market, so they wanted to bring the outside market back. So it's an adaptation, pure and simple, using existing elements, putting in, well, it's a mix. It's very hard to say. You can see the column capitals and the lunettes, and we had to invent a new light, which is going around there, and the inside was used as a marketing tool for a very high class. You know, they were trying to get people to move back to the city, so you have to really give them a sell, you know, because they were all living probably halfway to Washington, D.C. or something in the country. So they put Persian rugs, and they had sound and light show and movies, and ultimately it would be a restaurant with private dining upstairs, a bar in one end, so it's kind of like a little riverboat kind of thing, and you could have outside dining outside it. Just a modest little building, but rather than throw it away, here you have something that becomes a little landmark. Here's a building done for the presbytery of in that area called John Knox Home. The series of buildings I'm going to show you now, I think the point I really have to make here is that these buildings are very common programs. What I mean to say is you're thrown in with very stringent budgets. We're trying to tell you what we can do here in a situation if we kind of lay back and see what's happening. And these buildings are really kind of conglomerations of parts. They're rooms, and you can squeeze them together in any funny bunch of ways that you want to do. So I'm going to show you a series of kind of pushed together forms that produce buildings that are very competitive and would normally come out in a box form. I think you'll see a lot of variety. This is in the middle of a shopping center, and they used the roof of the supermarket with a bridge out one side for the recreational space, but it was very nice for the elderly to be in there with the action. The views were to the east and west, or to the left and right, to the harbors of Norfolk. Therefore, this shaped building made it possible for everybody to see the distant naval might. You know, that's the big Navy yard there. If you'd had a rectangular building and still wanted to line it up with the street, there'd be nothing to look at. Here's the building. It comes to points at the end, and you can look out the stairs because it's in two slots. The plan is like this. The window at any one point on the middle of that building is looking, you can't see beyond the last salient, so it's like you're on the end. But everybody has a different feeling. There's a tremendous variety, and the corridors are open, and the building changes a lot as you go around it. This is the base. The modules are within reason, but they're not strict or rigid. You see, we're putting these things where one's flexible notion of accommodation would put them. You see some shear walls that go, and then the columns are missing. There's the two gaps in there. This is the arcade. I'm trying to show that there are many ways of doing what would normally be a throwaway project to break it, to make it come alive and become something quite exciting. And this has been our role, I think, to find ways of doing subsidized housing that make it a virtuous or a good thing for, people want to live in these buildings. Here's the effect of a corner cut out of a room gives you a focus, a diagonal focus, a sense of space in a room. If you can cut the corner at the side off it, and the arrangement, the bathing of two walls with light tends to use that window as like a light source naturally, but you're using both of those walls as reflecting surfaces. So the lightness, it's like a headlight with the surrounding reflector. Little windows that actually give you a view, those little square things give you a view out of your kitchen. Now into the variations. Many variations can be taken from the fact that you're just going to bunch together these kinds of spaces. This is another perspective of a Methodist home, not built. But the situation here is that we finally discovered, a contractor told us why these things were competitive. We had come up with less perimeter. I'll show you a building that, I'm not sure this one had less perimeter. I'll show you the one that actually had less perimeter to the point that it made it competitive. This had floor lounges at the upper end, a larger core for communal or laundry and so forth. I'm trying to indicate a few things that these buildings, when you look at them, they tend to disappear. They go away from you. Here's one that the same principle coming out differently. We took the plan, it's in a kind of a locked-in site. We rotated it, not caring which way it oriented towards the street, to a point to maximize the views of Lake Michigan. But a building on the west side of the room on the west side of a building like this can have a view of Lake Michigan on the east. If anybody's ever been in Marina City in Chicago, which is the corn cobs as they're affectionately called, if you're on the west side, you have a view of Lake Michigan due to the shape always going away from you. So here again is a building that's not round, but massed together in such a way that all you have to do is draw lines between where your eye is in that window and what the view is. And we tried to give rotated and almost like a computer find out where the most of those were going to be. And there's the same building with one half, the axial top half reversed, accommodating other conditions. This is one I'd really like to build. Unfortunately not. It's got very few columns, very thin, but you say this is arbitrary. I say it's responding to a need. One need is that the next slide will show you the street going parallel to the general line of that left-hand facade and the street going parallel to the general line of the right-hand. It's on a splayed lot, so we took that into account. And then that sweeping form on the back allows even a person on the back of that building to have views out. Here it is on the lot. So why can't we do this? Well, the truth of the matter is we can. Here's one that the contractor told us why it was competitive. It has $60,000 less skin on it than a building of any building that you could put plans in and would have the equivalent floor area It just goes with geometry. The closer you are to a circle, the less perimeter you have on a prism, if you see what I mean. The minimum perimeter of any given area is a circle. You can enclose the most with the least perimeter with a circle. Well, we don't want to build circles because Marina City is inefficient. It has fan-shaped rooms, and we haven't woven any fan-shaped rugs yet, but we're getting down to it. It's getting close. But I mean, this kind of thing is really orthogonal on the inside. You're looking through the windows to the sky, so you've got essentially through ventilation. On the left, you're looking at sky. That's like a flying bridge. There it is, changing as you go around. This has got 200 units in it. Normally, a 200-unit building would be a slab and cast a big shadow. This is like a tree trunk. It's very thin, and it goes away from you. It has the ability to disappear. So I hate high-rises. This is the best you can do if you have to have a high-rise, I think, because it just feels less volumetric, less overpowering. Now we have a very strange site here again. You can see the accommodation of that site is made with this lozenge shape, and it would be more difficult with a square that would start impinging very quickly on the returning street, that left-hand diagonal street. There is minimum perimeter. There's quite a bit of cross ventilation. The flying bridge unit is down at the left here. The columns are placed as one can place them with reinforced concrete with a certain amount of wavering. Since the reinforcing rods bend as you lay them down, most people think columns have to line up. That is a serious and dangerous area in housing. What you're really trying to do is start with your plan. Everything else is subservient. You're trying to start with your social program, as it were, whatever you want to do. You're trying to give the maximum amount of good accommodation for the person in there, and you start with a plan. You put the columns in as it suits you, in closets and within certain range of limits. But to try to start something like housing with 30-foot grids, 20-foot grids, it leads to defeat. I think it may lead to defeat on office buildings, but the wave there on office buildings is so strong with manufactured modules. I would like to sometimes try this kind of format that I just showed you for office buildings, because what they really want is to maximize the corner office, because you can rent it for more. If you have 100 corners on a high-rise office building and go to the office landscape plan, that's the idea that would maybe help the dreadful dregs of office buildings that we're looking at. This is the housing that takes the undulating views up and down the streets. Again, maybe Jane Jacobs' idea of bay windows. This housing goes with that high stuff. It's done in the, early 70s, I guess. This is Chicago, I don't think you'd want to do this. That's Stanley. That's Stanley Tigerman. Stanley was here last year, and he's a very, of course, close friend of mine, and we've been friends for a number of years. And yet his architectural thinking is diametrically opposed to mine, and we, given these things, I wanted to show his work because of the level and the way he goes about it and the way we react to each other. This was this townhouse program. I'm sure he showed you this last year. His symbolic effort at a townhouse, which was totally non-programmatic, you might say, and merely exploring theory. Well, knowing that I had to go next to Stanley, I did this one, which is about where I am, and I always have been, trying to make form out of something which was traditional in shape. In fact, this is slightly Polish, because in Chicago you build one in the back, and then when you get enough money you build one in the front. So this was one in the back and one in the front, Polish style. And it has a centralized facade, but again you see the lineup of the so-called Chicago 7, which jumps around between 8 and 11 and whatever. BB Booth, I'm reading from left to right. Cohen, Jim Fried, who's dropped out because he's moved back to New York with I.M. Pei's office. Helmut Jahn, Jim Nagel, Stanley, and my job. I think this is a nice view of where the architectural thing is these days. It expresses how I felt about it. I didn't want to move much off history, although I believe in history as much as anybody. And if it's Romanesque or whatever, my centralized solution was, I wanted to do that. I wanted to be realistic, as opposed to and not dealing with transparency, which maybe these deal with, or I don't know. Stanley's unfortunately doesn't show up here, but it's poetic and it's surrealistic. Very much transparency on this one. Historic recall, but you see, I'm trying to say that this is classic detail, Palladian and so forth, as is this. This is a centralized system. I'm trying to distinguish this, which I don't believe in quite, and this, which, if anything, it's Romanesque, and I think the projects coming up. This dips into, again, the real heavy and difficult work that we do is inner city work. It's we have right now 1,500 buildings that have been, they are HUD receivers, 1,500 units in about 150 buildings that are in condition not quite this bad, but this was a shot just before they wrecked Frank Lloyd Wright's Francisco Terrace, one of his 3 multiple family projects. We made a deal with the city of Chicago where we would rescue the ornament, which is the terracotta around this entrance. It goes into a hollow donut, and it was supposed to be typical and prototypical workers' housing of the late 90s. We saved what was important and put it in a new project. Here is the front entrance. So we kind of honored the basic backdrop, but changed it into townhouses. So this is a heresy in a way, I think. The Wright fans are incensed. It's a permutation. The corner towers used to be stairwells. Now they're just gazebos. They're little lookouts in those corner units. The courtyard has been foreshortened. Facades have been added on the sides and ends that didn't exist before, because the only facade was this facade, but it had another bay on either end. We couldn't find a site that was big enough. So in a sense, it's honoring the central part of the building, is honoring the proportions, and unfortunately not as well built. You know, Wrights, they can't get this kind of workmanship, but the 2 side portals and the columns above, the cornice and the main entrance and the inside towers are Frank Lloyd Wright. And if someone wants to live in a Frank Lloyd Wright thing, that's where they could buy it. This is a project of Cynthia Weese. It's very Midwest. I think it expresses our desire to be close to the earth. It's the before shot of a corn crib. This is by Champaign, Illinois. You just take the slats and you back them up with insulation and you cut them and put Z-frames on them, and when it's shut up it still looks like a corn crib, but when you open the shutters you have an inside, the runway through it of course was just a dirt track where they'd throw in, the grain bins were removed except the ones upstairs were turned into bedrooms, so you have a very large open space. Furniture made for the occasion, kind of shaker type furniture. Very diffuse light. Air circulation is fantastic because the cupola acts that, and just convection currents climb up through this. It's a little oasis. This is another project by Cynthia Weese, a very expensive house in the country. Again, I do believe it partakes a little bit of the Romanesque or heavy the roof is very important, and overhangs, a lot of glass looking into the, but not too much, clear story. And what you get is a kind of a series of bridges that penetrate the trees, and you can look back across them. So you have the master bedroom wing on this end, the Galleria, the kind of diagonal, and then the living room and the 4-car garage or something. And This will be given justice in Architectural Digest sometime later. It's going to have a lot of pages on it. I think it's going to be a very serene and appropriate. It's not very wild, or it's none of those things I guess I said. It's not very complex, but it's very comfortable. Here's a house I did. It's the before shot. This is in Michigan. It's our little place, but I think I had to show it because it kind of shows. That's, again, the before. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the next shot. It's just a barn that you put windows in. One of the rules established is never put the window at the same elevation twice. It's all heated by wood. Nothing fancy. In fact, that's what we're trying to say. Nothing fancy. I once remember an anecdote by Alvar Aalto, who I had the great fun of showing through Chicago once. I kept asking him about this and that. It was in the 60s when the Sydney Opera House had just been awarded. I forget who was on that jury. I think Errol Serene was, in fact. And other things were happening. The Toronto City Hall had just been commissioned, and that was one of his fellow countrymen. And I said, what do you think of all of this things? And he said, they shouldn't go so far. He was speaking of all these sculptural shapes. Now, the TWA terminal was done at that time by Serene, kind of the flying bird type analogy. And of course, the tremendous difficulties they had with the Sydney Opera House. It was a terrible thing to put an acoustic space inside those shells. And the Toronto City Hall was kind of woeful and arbitrary. And he says, they should just be nice boys, he says. They shouldn't go so far. And that's really one of the nicest things I ever heard. They shouldn't try so hard, he said. They should just be nice boys. And he said that in his broken finish. Here's a beautiful building. We probably should have left it alone. There again, the windows that never come in the same place. This building it's 24 by 36, and it sits on a lot that's 32 by 42. Again, the shaker thing, there are no closets. And I really shouldn't have shown this film because I haven't got a patent on it yet, but this is my doorknob, and I don't want anybody to use it because it's very special. You take a piece of railing stock, 1 3/4 inches, you drill it eccentrically with a 5/8 inch dowel, and you make a friction fit on both sides of the door. And then you mount it on this panel, of course, and you have a stop here of the same size, and you just rotate it over it's a very nice doorknob, and there's no metal in it. And I'm sure it's been done before, but it's my favorite detail. There it is again in the bathroom. See, there's the dowel. You just can rotate that on or off the stop. There is the wood. I guess he used screws. He shouldn't have, but that's your locking device. So there it is. Here again, in Michigan, I talked earlier to Mr. Bracken. This is on the highest hill in Michigan. I knew it was because I got the geodetic surveys. Then I had to build a tower to make sure that no one was higher. So this looks across Lime Lake to Sugarloaf Resort. It's a 60-foot tower that I put telephone poles in the ground on, and then made a lattice of gradually thinning out for shear, very heavy shear at the bottom, and then it thins out at the top, so that this is the slide that I forgot. I was supposed to show you the picture of the tower. But it did get built. I built it myself, and it hasn't blown down yet. It's 60 feet high, and there's the shadow of me, me photographing me on the ground there. This is one I built too, but I never finished. And it's actually been published in a very obscure Japanese magazine. I decided in my living room one night that I could build something that was 13 feet on a side, but it's actually built like a fireplace, and it has 4 levels plus a lot of sleeping levels in the tower there. and that acts like a chimney. It's got flaps, so if you open the door, it really does, on a very hot day, ventilate out through the top. And it's a place to go through and torture yourself for the weekend. But we build it ourselves. This is the work of Weese Hickey Weese. Handicap facility. They found the only hill in the whole place, and so it's on 6 levels. It's got a solar heating system, and it's for physically handicapped, to train them, to rehabilitate them, to be independent of any kind of institutionalized help. So this diagram shows the arrangements of the living units, and the green shows the circulation, so you can see the breakdown of the system, how it works. This diagram is color-coded for the levels, so that the central spine that goes through it is actually a series of ramps. And so it's got 6 levels. Diagrammatic, isometrically, the requirement of a solar system was more extreme than the amount of roof available, so that it allowed us to overhang this is a kind of an abstraction. I colored this because we presented it in front of the New York 5, or one of those groups, so I had to color it. It really isn't any coloring at all, but I had to show them I was interested in color, so I put it on there. This is actually it, under construction. And the angles, of course, are dictated, the south-facing angles at least. Every unit has access directly outside. It's got a lot of insulation and attics. We're reintroducing attics, roof shapes and forms that allow us to do what we should have naturally done anyway. If you get a bad roof, it still is going to be okay because the water is going to drain. This is Temple Beth Sholem, and this is more of an extended care facility, or eventually for elderly, related to the contour of the land is the reason that these pods bend, and up on the left there will be an additional extended care facility. But a lot of people in this, we wanted to get the scale back. So again, I'm trying to show you something that's casual. The corridors break out a lot, and they bend. The facade changes material so that each vertical unit breaks down, and it's deinstitutionalized. This is a building where we rehabilitated the inside of a worthless Kmart that had gone bankrupt. But a very rich man decided it would be wonderful for his headquarters. So the program was, this is a man who sells collector's plates by mail. He wanted his collector's plates museum, and he wanted his corporate headquarters. And he wanted an interior environment because, gee, out there in the suburbs where this is, there was nothing but cars, as you can see. So there was a spinal garden that would be your recreational use, and the office area generally on the upper part, and the museum down below. But the effect of the internal environment was quite pleasing. The noise of flowing water masks voices, so that you can have, if you have enough background noise, you can have privacy. So it's an office landscape, really. No wall. Here's a building, I think it goes on the other side of our feeling about, this is very formal, but it's a bank, and we wanted them to, they wanted a sense of security and presence and symbolic. So I think this, if anything, if our other stuff with the strange shapes and bent and agglomerated was kind of informal and romantic, if you will, this is kind of formal and Romanesque, I guess. The inside, very simple, central columns. My drawing of how it should look. We're taking a lot from Louis Sullivan here, I have to say that. It makes me less sure about it because it is it is that. Here it is again. You know any of his small banks. I think it's the right way to do it. If you have to make a box, something more than the joining together of the windows into some kind of a motif and the importance of the entrance. Certainly Sullivan, we're not going to have any ornament. It's just our era is not for that. But we'll have some very fine brick, maybe in 2 colors, and try to elicit a certain amount of power from a very small building. And there is no excuse for going into that other kind of agglomerated form, because here's a totally flat site. You can't react to contours, and a totally rectilinear program. And on top of that, no way of multiplying the costs. The high-rises are easiest to do in those weird shapes, but this is the first low-rise we were able to pursue our madness, which is really ugly. I mean, in a sense, I really tell you, Stanley Tigerman always criticizes this as being ugly in a farmyard, and he wants to hear the braying of the mules and the oinking of the pigs and everything, but I like that. But you see the shapes are pretty bent, put together, unthought, but you're trying to let the thing take its own shape. You're trying to stand back and say, what's going to happen here? So we'll see what happens. This is what happens, and I'm telling you, this is rock bottom housing. This is Section 8 family housing. So this is being built, but it's got a roof, it's got an attic, it's got a sense of I don't know whether it's Swiss chalet or I don't know, but there it is in my drawing. It shows a kind of, again, it changes as it goes around. This is our response to the box, I guess. That's my last slide, and that's my latest trip to Pisa, and on that I will read my conclusion. I would like to leave these thoughts out of an architectural involvement of about, I guess, 20 years. One word comes closest to my ideal of a direction and a motivating force. The word is simplicity. In all things, whether it is a goal to be achieved in designing buildings or in pursuing one's life, we all participate in history at the impoverished level even of the latest newspaper, magazine article, or TV extravaganza. But we should do better. The mistake is that we are dealing with values whether we wish to or not. We discover we cannot escape. Somewhere deep inside, we are also ultimately responsible for what we do. Nothing is a throwaway. I am happy in pursuit of a limited number of goals. For an architect, that means to me small projects in a small office. One might regret that many clients, often the large and the corporate, ruled by the ruling taste and guided by committees whose members all are somewhat afraid of each other, produce the safe taste, the glib image, consensus architecture, and often the dregs that we see in our environment. They should let the untried ideas freshen and challenge their viewpoint. I am very often too much in conflict with prevailing values to realize an accommodation with them. My values show, I hope they do, and that's the important point. The perfect situation to me is the absolute congruence of humane social purpose and the built building. Extend it, if you can, to the environment. Social purpose, so refined, channeled, and disciplined, becomes art. Thank you. Yeah, I'd sure be happy, because I didn't explain everything, if anybody wants to challenge or say anything, be happy to answer, expand on this talk. Maybe it wasn't clear, but I was trying. Any questions? If not, I can just stand here later and talk to anybody if they want to. And if not, I'm still going to be around, as our other members are, to harass you periodically here for this 10-week session.